Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast with Darren Mitchell. If you're a sales leader looking to take your leadership to a whole new level, then this is the podcast for you. We'll be exploring tips, techniques, and strategies to help you take your leadership to the exceptional level and allow you to enjoy more money, more meaning, and better sales results. All right, welcome back to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast. This is Darren Mitchell, and absolute pleasure to welcome today Mr. Don Lazzari, who is the president of Delivering Value LLC and the author of Entrepreneur's Sales Secrets Revealed, coming in all the way from New Orleans. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well. Pleasure to be here.
Now, we're just talking that it's around 5 p.m. your time and about 9 a.m. here in Melbourne. So I was saying normally 5 o'clock is coffee time for me, but you were saying it's red wine time almost at 5 p.m. for you.
That's correct.
And yet there's no red wine I can't see any red wine on the Zoom.
Well, that's just out of respect for you, Darren.
Appreciate that, Don. And hey, we're looking forward to this conversation because you've got a very long and esteemed history in sales and sales leadership and working with sales organizations. So love to delve into some of the key lessons that you've learned over your career, and particularly out of the work you've been doing with, I think, over 50 entrepreneurial organizations in the last 15 years?
Yes.
So I'm sure you would have gathered a lot of intelligence and a lot of information that can now be shared with hopefully millions of people around the world. Before we jump into the nitty gritty, I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of background in terms of your career, what led you to sales, but specifically what sort of is the catalyst for you to do what you do today?
Sure. Well, I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with a degree in writing and went into television.
Okay.
Loved it. I was not in front of the camera. I produced. Then I got a corporate job. And to be completely honest, the thing that drove me towards sales was the fact that I hated being in the office so much. And I worked for a company where for 18 months, I basically did their marketing. And then they approached me and said, look, we think you're a good guy. In order to get anywhere in this company, you have to go into sales. And I said, well, I never really pictured myself as a salesperson. And they said, you get a company car, a $10,000 raise in commission. And I said, when do I start? And 2 weeks after that, I had a windshield territory. I drove around most of Pennsylvania, most of Ohio. And I realized after just 2 weeks that I'd found my place in the sun.
And what was it that you loved it? Was it the fact you're out and not in the office, or was there something else that sort of
out and not in the office, having to communicate in many, many different ways? When I remember early interviews where people said, well, a writing degree, what does that have to do with sales? And my response would always be, listen, I've been trained to assemble words and facts in such a way as to persuade an audience. The only difference now is I'm doing it verbally.
Yeah.
So it just clicked with me. And I love the thrill of the chase. And my career went from my initial sales job. We sold barcode print and apply machines.
Okay.
Way back when the UPC code was just coming out.
Yeah.
So this was, latter part of the 80s.
Yeah.
And from that point forward, I just continued to find jobs where I was working for companies that had what was effectively emerging technologies. So I went from being a territory rep into a regional rep, into a national rep, into an international rep. Nice. Working for smaller companies. I worked for Rockwell Automation for 5 years. At the time, they were 23,000 employees. I think they're probably 40,000 at this point. Got a chance to travel all over Europe and sell things to people in different countries. But I've just been drawn to it. And then in 2005, I joined a company where they were taking speech recognition into warehouses to assist in order selection. And then they acquired a company that was taking that into healthcare. And that was my last full-time role. Okay. And much of what I do with consulting the genesis of it started then, because we grew it from 250,000 to 22.5 million in 3.5 years.
Wow.
And a lot of that had to do with having a good team, but also kind of having a good sales performance management approach and system.
Mm.
And then in late 2009, private equity got involved with that company, and I decided that it was time for me to go. And I started my consulting. I started my consulting company, promising myself that I would never work for anyone full time ever again.
Yeah.
And almost 15 years later, here I am.
Nice. And was it the fact that the private equity came in and you thought there was going to be some significant changes, or was there something else
Oh,
that said, now's
they
the most
rated us, Darren. They
as they
rated
do,
us. They played dirty.
as they do.
All the bad things you hear about private equity. Yeah.
Oh man.
But it was motivating. It was motivating.
And so fast forward to today, having spent 15 years in a consulting role, because we'll talk about some of the key lessons. What's the overarching thought process you've taken from the last 15 years that you now put forward to the organizations that you work with today?
Well, it's the approach that I have of managing sales performance within this framework that I refer to as sales vital signs.
Yeah.
And what that really looks at is the management of the sales function from a higher area. So it is, do we have enough incoming interest at the top, being the first sales vital sign, which is new to funnel,
Mm.
right? And then how much interest do I have up there? And do
Yeah.
I have enough to create pressure to push things into the pipeline as I'm converting interest into action and then move things through the pipeline to close?
Mm.
So when you begin to measure those vital signs both across a team and individually, that really helps you to pinpoint where a rep might need help,
Yeah.
where you might need to turn up the heat on the marketing side. It gives you a lot of clarity into where am I actually in relation to the number I have to hit at the end of the year, and what do I need to be doing to make sure I keep that pressure
Mm.
pushing deals out of the pipe.
Yeah.
That's really the core of what the consultancy has been. How to show companies how to do that, and then often we'll stick around and be fractional sales management for them.
Yeah. 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 Which is becoming more and more prevalent in business today. Not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
having a full-time sales director or sales manager, having somebody to come in for a short period of time, or just come in for little bits of time each month to keep things on an even keel or pushing in the right direction.
Right. Yeah. The definition of a successful engagement for me is I've helped them build a team that's hitting their numbers consistently,
Yeah.
and they're adding to the team. And then they say, "Hey, Don, would you consider coming to work for us?" And I say, "No, but I'll help you find my replacement." And that to me is real success. Or if the company has been sold or acquired or whatever.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because one of the things I talk to sales leaders a lot about is getting themselves into a position where they are literally making themselves redundant in their role. And that's not redundant to the point where they're no longer needed, but it's redundant to the point where, as you say, the numbers are so good, the momentum is so good, the culture is really good. That person now has developed a team where they're no longer required in that particular enterprise or that particular organization. So that's actually a good thing.
Right. Like to me, that's when you should be managing performance and not managing sales.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. Absolutely. So over the last 15 years, then, having come out of a fairly large organization, although you grew the organization to be pretty big, where have you found most of your consultant gigs and businesses you're working with? What sort of space do they operate in? Is it the large enterprise, small entrepreneurs, mid-sized enterprises? Where's I guess, the sweet spot you've found yourself in?
It's really going to be small to medium. So companies that are 3 million that want to be five, five that want to be 10, 10
Yeah.
that want to be 30. Right.
Yeah.
And that tends
Nice.
to be the range. Once you get to the point of where the company's clicking along at 30, 40 million, it typically does obviate the need for someone to be there full time,
Mm.
to be, doing contract calls and all the other things that come along with that rising tide.
Yeah, because as the company becomes more successful and you get more customers coming on board, you've got to have some sort of mechanism and framework to manage them, continue to provide service to them, and hopefully increase the share of wallet that we have with them as well.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So over that time, what was it that prompted you to write the book?
You know what prompted me to write the book? A couple of things. One, I had always wanted to write a business book.
Okay.
Uh, Never really wanted to write fiction. I wrote plenty of fiction in college. I enjoyed it, but it was never really something I was drawn to. But I always thought that I wanted to do it.
Hmm.
And I thought the timing's got to be right in order for it to be meaningful. Like, I don't think I could have written this book 15 years ago, right? I needed the track record. I needed the collective experience, so to speak. But
Yeah.
what inspired me to write it is the fact that there's so many similarities in the way entrepreneurs approach certain things, especially when it comes to sales,
Yeah.
that I felt like I had to tell them about it. Because I wouldn't say that they make the same mistakes, because saying mistake is just a little too harsh, but the tendencies are very similar.
Yeah.
It's funny when you begin to work for all of these different companies, and entrepreneurs come in all different sorts of flavors, and when you see, despite all the personality differences and whatnot, that the similarities are there,
Yeah.
and making them aware of it, I think is valuable.
Mm. And when you think about it, a lot of the entrepreneurs, they're very good technicians. They're very smart people. They've developed a product or they've developed a service. And at the beginning, at least, they are the salesperson.
Mm-hmm.
And they come from a position, it's almost like it's their baby, for want of a better term. And it's because I love to delve into how they make the transition from, okay, I've got this fantastic product, it's now, or service, it's now wanted in the marketplace. And how do we get them to now relinquish control of that and bring some people in to maybe now start to sell that product so they can work on expanding the business to hopefully get to a substantial stage so that venture capitalists can come in and buy it
Yeah,
out.
exactly. Or they
um,
can be acquired by competition, even better, right?
Exactly, exactly. But I'm really intrigued because the title of the book is an interesting one, Sales Secrets Exposed or Revealed. And a lot of entrepreneurs in their businesses start out with being a solo person, being the only person. So, um, what are your thoughts and what have you noticed with solopreneurs in terms of they're the only salesperson? What are some things that they do or need to do or need to be aware of so they give themselves every opportunity of having that platform for growth?
Sure. Um, Often I'll get asked the question, if you can give one bit of advice rather to a solopreneur, what would it be? And my advice is, don't assume that the value of your product is self-evident.
Yeah.
Don't make that mistake. So you've got to communicate very, very effectively with the folks who you are trying to sell to, because chances are they're not technically adept as you are.
Yeah.
So they're not going to get a lot of that. So one of the things that I do in almost every engagement that I get involved in is look at the sales message.
Hmm.
Like, what can you do to distill your message down to three main points? And that doesn't mean that you forsake everything else, but that just means that that's how you categorize things.
Yeah.
And there's rationale behind that, because if you really look at the studies on memory, if I do a presentation to someone, a 1 hour presentation, 1 hour later, they only remember 50% of what I told them.
Yeah.
A few days later, 10%. By the following week, it's a headline.
Mm.
So you want to be certain that the three things that you're trying to stress, you stress over and over and over again. And often I'll see solopreneurs just come out and just hammer someone with a potpourri of features. without really telling them, look, these are the main things this is going to do for you. And let me give you a specific example going back to my very last full-time role,
Yeah.
where we were selling into senior care, and we distilled down the benefits of that company into three things: better documentation, better reimbursement, better care. We had a highly functional product,
Yeah.
but anytime we talked about it, we bolted all those features back to that. Here's how you get better documentation.
Mm.
Then you can talk about the bells and whistles, right? But we'd always come back to that and make sure things would go around that. That's one huge key for a solopreneur to understand, which is you've got to take that and distill it down into three main points. And you've got to keep distilling until you've got something that you think is effectively perfect. And then you've got to evangelize it like the Vatican.
And the key thing there, as I'm hearing you talk about that, is it's got to be 3 points that are not beneficial to me as the seller of the product or the service, but it's got to be 3 points that are going to be beneficial to the potential customer. So better documentation, better care, and better, what was the second?
Reimbursement.
Better
The second
reimbursement.
was reimbursement. Yeah.
They're all benefits that that organization is going to be able to derive from that particular product or that particular service. And I
Correct.
think, and I love your thoughts on this because a lot of the sales teams that I work with, they're very good at talking about how good their product is. But when they're talking about their product, they are coming from the features of that product, thinking that that's going to wow the customer into just leaning forward and throwing over the money, right?
Right. Right.
It's got to be more about what's in it for them as the customer.
Right. Yeah, I remember talking to a gent, and we didn't go forward. He was a startup. He really was not able to acquire any funding. And I said, "What are the three reasons why I should buy your product?" And he said, "We're cloud based, we have AI, and we're easy to use." And I go, that's not going to sell your product.
Yeah,
There are thousands of people that are saying that, right?
yeah,
Tell me something meaningful.
yeah,
And it's kind of funny, way back when in the early days, everyone had read Crossing the Chasm. Are you familiar with Crossing the
yeah,
Chasm by Jeffrey
yeah.
Moore? And one of his disciples, Paul Weifels, wrote a book which is called the Chasm Companion.
Hmm.
And he takes those theories and distills them down into practical applications. Great book. I've used it for decades.
Hmm.
And one of the things that he says that I repeat over and over again to the folks when I'm doing consulting is, do not confuse your compelling reason to sell with the prospect's compelling reason to buy.
Yeah,
And I see a lot of that,
yeah,
right? The companies that are successful, they tap into the benefits that the customers are looking for. And they also couch their stories in successes and don't just talk about the product.
and I
That's
and I
fundamental.
yeah, and I suspect they also have this ability to remove themselves from the outcome of having to close a particular customer as well. So by removing that, they make it more about the customer and what the benefit's going to be for them and focus all their attention to the point where if there's a match, then there's a more likelihood of the buyer wanting to make a buying decision versus feeling as if they're being sold to by all the wonderful bells and whistles that this product has.
When I worked for Rockwell, one of the people that I consider to be my mentor there said, our job is to paint the dream of the future state.
That's well said, isn't
There's a
it?
lot of wisdom there,
There
right?
is. Absolutely. And so with that, what other, because there'll be people that are listening to this who do have a solopreneur kind of setup. Um, three key messages is a good part. Any other key fundamentals that as a solo entrepreneur, a solo person, that they need to be aware of when it comes to, I guess, expanding and giving themselves every opportunity of growth.
Sure. A couple of things. One, you don't have to take a sales training class, but you need to at least be familiar with the fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
Of the typical stuff. BANT. Does this
Yeah.
client have budget? Do I have access to the right people? Do they have a true need? And what's the timing?
Yeah.
Often what I'll see is as soon as someone expresses interest in something, they're just anxious to go show off their baby, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a prospect.
Mm.
That's one. Two, I don't think that solopreneurs understand enough about trying to drive out objections. Often I'll hear a filibuster of a
Hmm.
presentation,
Yeah.
and especially over Zoom, they just slide after slide. It's a filibuster instead of stopping along the way and saying, Darren, does this make sense to you?
Yeah.
Can you see how this will fit in your organization?
Yeah.
And try to get those objections to come out. I don't remember who the wise sales sage was that said selling doesn't start until you get your first objection. And therefore you need to look for it, right?
Yeah.
You definitely need to look for them. And then one other thing that always kind of gets a grin out of people is sometimes you just need to shut up, right? Sometimes if you've done your job and you've connected the dots between your solution and how it can help solve business problems,
Mm.
and suddenly you've got folks in the meeting that are talking about how much this would help them, don't say anything. I call it the STFU rule. You could probably figure out what that stands for, right?
Shut the fruit up.
That's right. Exactly. And then when they finish, don't say anything for 5 or 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And then, now, too often I've seen people jump into that because they get frothy and
Yeah.
it interrupts that dynamic. And that's not a dynamic you want to touch.
No. It's interesting you say that a lot of salespeople, and I've been guilty of this as well in my career, where you've got the customer at a point where they're probably ready to make a purchasing decision, and you recognize that as a salesperson or even as a sales leader, there's just a bit more information I want to provide them that hopefully will just tip it over the edge even further. And we don't recognize the buying signals and we don't shut up and we keep selling to the point where we start to undo the clothes.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. And, I learned that very, very early on in my sales career.
Yeah.
And I was out with an independent rep, and that dynamic was happening.
Yeah.
And I interrupted, and he kicked me under the table. We were at a conference room table, and he kicked me pretty hard. And when we were walking out to the car, I'm like, Joe, why did you kick me? And he said, because you should have STFU. I said, I got
Got
it.
it.
And that has stuck with me for quite some time.
And it's a really powerful selling tool. But I will say that a lot of people find it quite uncomfortable to maintain even a short period of silence, and they wanted to fill it with something, and the ums and the ahs or something. And it's an old saying I know, but in sales it's always like the first person to speak is the one doing the buying.
Especially when you get to that point, right?
Yeah. So maintain the silence and understand that when you're providing information to a potential customer, they need some time to process it from their conscious mind perspective. So holding that space is actually it's a difficult thing to do, but something that can be learnt over time. And I think most of us can learn from overcoming any inhibitions we might have about just sitting in silence because it is a bit awkward if you're not used to it.
Oh yeah, and as a salesperson, it can be a wonderful tool.
Yeah.
You know, a five count of silence can get you pretty far.
Oh, I can. I can.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the context then of making a pitch, doing a presentation, is that one of the key things to think about that you think is a differentiator after the presentation? So you mentioned before that when you're presenting, try to draw out objections as you go rather than going
Mhm.
through copious amounts of information and not taking a breath. Because when I facilitate, for example, I like to make sure that it's not a one-way conversation, it's two-way.
Mhm.
So it's very much conversational. So I'll weave content into the conversation, so to try and draw out stuff. Are you saying then that one of the key strategies after the presentation is to use that silence? And if so, what else can people use after the presentation to I guess increase credibility or maximize the opportunities of moving towards a close?
Well, one thing that I don't see enough of, frankly, is good follow-up after a presentation. And I see people rush to generate a proposal,
Yeah,
which to me, you want to delay the proposal until they're almost ready.
yeah,
But in addition to that, there's just not enough um, focus afterwards on reinforcing the value of what you talked about. One, you've got to remind them. Remember, we talked about just a few minutes ago. They're only
mm,
going to remember a portion of what you talked about. So
yeah,
your follow up needs to be very effective in reiterating the points that they liked
mm,
and reminding them of why there's value. And also, especially for solopreneurs, the one thing you cannot do not get single threaded.
mm,
If you've got one person in there that loves you, try to get as many people to the table as you can
yeah,
because you want those other sources of information.
you do.
And I see that commonly with reps out there who they get a receptive individual and that's the only person they communicate with. And then suddenly you're like, why didn't that deal close this month? I don't know. He's gone dark on me. Well, what's going on? I don't know. Well, if you had other people at the table and afterwards you followed up with them and you open those dialogues, you can then go to those individuals for information. And I don't see enough of that from less experienced salespeople and
Mm.
from solopreneurs who tend to be technologists.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And I remember when I was running sales teams in corporate, we always used to talk about the breadth and the depth and have good coverage and not just have that one-dimensional relationship. And a good sales team will actually have a really good understanding of the internal power map within that organization. And by that I mean not just the hierarchy, but who's the influencing lines and who influences who. So, if I've got a good person in an organization who seems to be quite receptive, realistically, they might just like coffee, right? They might like
Right.
the I guess the notoriety that comes with being wanted, right? Because nobody wants them in the organization. But from an internal perspective, they may not be an influencer or somebody that has any real authority. So having a map mapped out in terms of what do I know about the organization, how do I get multiple people involved is a key thing. What do you say though? Because I'm sure you might have come up with this, and I know I certainly have. What do you say to sales teams or solopreneurs where they say, you know what, the company that I'm working with or that I'm trying to sell into, they're very protective as to who you're allowed to talk to and so forth. It's really hard to get access to certain people. How do we break down those barriers?
Well, when you're a solopreneur, it's a little more difficult because you can't tag someone else to help,
Yeah,
right? So it's a bit more difficult there. But as a solopreneur, you can still reach out to the leader of that company. You're a CEO yourself,
yeah,
right? So don't be afraid if you're talking to, whatever, someone in IT to send a note to the CEO, CEO to CEO.
mm,
Now, when reps are involved, I'm very big on that to be like, look, you know what? Have the COO send a note to the COO in that company or the CEO in that company
mm,
and just saying, hey, I'm aware that our teams are working together. If there's anything I can do to answer any questions about the company or I can add any value to this equation, please let me know.
yeah,
So, and my
yeah.
light's getting a little dark outside of my office window. So let me see if I can make that let's see if I can make that a little better.
Well, I was going to say it's 5:30 in New Orleans. What time does the sun go
Uh,
down?
that's no better. Okay. We'll have to live with the moodiness. We're starting to get the sun doesn't set until 7.
Okay.
But my office faces east, so as the
Oh,
sun
right.
proceeds
On the other
around,
side.
um, it goes from being way too bright to moody.
Love it, love it. All right, so let's pivot a little bit and talk
Yeah.
about building, I guess, a well-performing sales engine. Now this can be in a small enterprise solopreneur, but some key fundamentals in relation to how do we build and scale a sales engine that actually performs?
Sure. Well, first off, when you're interviewing salespeople, the one thing, in my opinion, that you cannot train is drive.
Yeah,
So you want to look for people who are driven.
yeah.
Um, I became friends with a guy who wrote a book 20 years ago called Never Hire a Bad Salesperson Again. Chris Croner's his name.
Oh, really?
Clinical psychologist, bright guy. And that was the thing that he did in his study, where he looked at high performing salespeople and said, what is it that separate the great from the good? And his principle, which I completely subscribe to, having 2 decades of experience since reading it, is the folks that have this intrinsic need to achieve can be very successful. You can train them other stuff, but you cannot train drive.
Wow.
So you've got to look for that. You've got to ask questions in the interview about, when did you go the extra mile, or what is it that makes you want to get up in the morning. And then you've also got to ask them about specifics about deals that they've won and deals that they've lost.
Yeah.
And I mean specifics, right? Tell me who was at the table, what was their role, how did you sell to them? You've got to get down in the gutty work, so to speak.
Yeah.
But you also have to approach it with, it's a no until this person convinces me it's a yes.
Yeah.
And most people go the other way around.
Yeah.
Or worse yet, I've seen many, many company leaders just get charmed by someone that really doesn't have the right stuff. And that can be difficult for folks who aren't in sales and really don't understand how that dynamic works.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a big part of it. You've got to look for people with drive. You got to look for people that can tell you basically play by play about how they won a deal and why they won it, or how they lost a deal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I love to hear is when I say, well, why do you think you lost that? And they say, it's because I missed something.
Yeah.
Right. It's never because that company had a feature, or it's all the salesperson. It was my fault.
Yes.
I missed something. I look for that. If they'll admit that, then they're reflective. And that's what you want. You want people to be thinking about their call right after it's over and how they can do better the next time around.
Because you want people to take ownership and take responsibility. And that's what we look for in leaders. Because the other thing that I'd be looking for as well is, as a sales leader, what's my succession plan looking like, and how do I bring people in who, through time and over with development, I can actually get them to a point where they can do what I do, so I'm released to do other things. It was interesting you mentioned Chris, because I had him on the podcast about 2 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. Chris and I have been associated. I read his manuscript.
Yeah. Okay. Very smart. Good.
Exceptionally smart guy. Very engaging.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, here's a question for you. I totally agree in terms of finding people who are driven. I have a little bit of a history of getting people in sales roles, perhaps a little bit off center, as in not necessarily having a full sales background and so on and so forth. You mentioned before that sales is a skill set that can be taught. What do you say to leaders that are looking to build a high performing team about the notion of, don't just look for people who have sales experience, but look for characteristics such as drive, because there might be some people who have drive in other areas that are not necessarily sales, but could make the transition. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think it's a difficult transition to make. I think people underestimate how difficult this can be, mainly because of the rejection.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult for people who aren't used to living in a world of no to come and live in a world of no.
Yeah.
That can be tough. But I think what you want to really look for, as far as just fundamentals, people that don't necessarily have sales experience, they've got to be inquisitive. I think a big part of being a good salesperson is asking insightful questions.
Yeah.
And then asking even more insightful follow-ups.
Mm.
When I do a workshop to get things started with clients, that I just refer to as ninja sales. It's really just a potpourri of just different tips and tricks and things like that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I stress in that is the fact that you've got to establish credibility. That is the number one thing a salesperson has. That's how I start that workshop, to say, what's the one thing a salesperson has to have? And I'll
Yeah.
get product knowledge, has to know how to close, has to know this, has to know that. And I'm like, no, folks, it's credibility.
Yeah.
Because if you're not credible in front of that client, they're not going to buy from you.
Yeah.
I don't care how good your product is. And that's something I think that is lost on folks. You've got to look for people who are credible.
And I think the point around asking insightful questions is really powerful. And I don't wanna gloss over that, because my experience working with thousands of salespeople over the last 10 years is that they're really good at telling, but not as good at asking. And so
Right.
every piece of information that they have to share with a prospective customer, I'm always saying, okay, how do you share that information, but follow it up with an insightful question that can draw out not just a yes, no, but draw out what the customer's actually thinking about, right? Because you want to be able to differentiate yourself, because that then points to credibility in the eyes of your customer, and separating you from every other rep that's coming in and doing the same thing, that is just throwing copious amounts of information, hoping that some of it's going to stick. Don't ever lose sight of the fact that if you can be a great questioner and be really curious, you'll go a long way to get a lot of information which will differentiate you.
No question.
Mm.
No question.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would tell solopreneurs that have demos, try to go 45 minutes into an hour meeting without going to your demo. Just ask a lot of good questions, because then you can tailor that demo to their needs, concerns, wants, and in
Yeah,
15 minutes you should be able to deliver your message.
that's it. That's
Right.
it.
And that's very difficult
Well,
for
it
the
is,
guys who have invented the product to do. They
because
want
they
to
just want
show
to show it. They're not sure to show it off. Here's my new shiny thing.
exactly, exactly.
But that, I guess, that's an attitude thing. So I'd like your thoughts on this, in terms of, okay, we need people with drive. We need people to drive credibility. Um, what about people's, I guess, attitude and mindset? And by that I mean not attaching themselves so much to the product, but almost having this mindset that I want to qualify this customer to see whether they, and I say this respectfully, deserve to see the product, or do they deserve to see the demo. And it's not an arrogant thing. It's just flipping it completely to say, hey, I just don't share this with anybody. I'm happy to share it with you, but you need to sort of justify as to why I'm going to spend even 15 minutes showing you what is the offering.
Right, right. That's something that I remember seeing when I was working for Rockwell
Yep.
25 years ago, where we walked into a manufacturing facility, and the VP of production came in and said, "Oh, Rockwell, what are you here to sell me?" And I said, "I haven't even seen your operation, so I don't know if I can sell you anything." And he
Yeah.
looked at me very quizzically. And I said, "Would you mind taking me on a tour?"
Yeah.
And we spent 45 minutes out on the floor. And anytime someone's taking you through their operation, it's money. That
Mm.
you're going to learn a lot about what's going on. They're willing to give you so much information. And then when we came back, he said, "Well, are you going to sell me anything?" And I said, "No, but I think I can solve one of your problems." And that it was just so anti-sales guy,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
typically you say, "Hey, what do you got to sell me?" Well, let me show you the latest and greatest and the piece of software. It's cloud-based and AI, and it's just a show up and throw up,
Yeah.
instead
Yeah.
of just focusing it in on the things that matter. The whole concept of, when I'm coaching, especially younger people who don't have as much experience, you need to figure out what their compelling reason to buy is.
Yeah.
It's normally just one or two things.
Yeah.
And if you can zero in on that and then have all your arrows hit those two spots on the target,
Yeah.
you're going to win more than you're going to lose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's all problem solving, because it's not about your features. Because I don't know that I've ever met a customer who wakes up thinking that I'm going to go and buy that product today.
No, no. That's what I tell people. I'm like, do you think people are sitting at their desk going, boy, I really wish I could find a cloud-based AI real-time, blah, blah, blah. No, they're not. So they're sitting there going, you know what? How can I improve my customer service score by 10%?
Yeah.
Or, how can I reduce the amount of working capital I have tied up in my warehouse?
Mm.
Right? That's what they're worried about. They're not worried about the whiz bangs and bells. Right. And if you put customer needs front and center, you're going to have their attention. And
I think,
while we're on that subject, Darren, something that drives me bananas that I see is when people want to go in and do a presentation
yeah.
and they want to spend the first 7 minutes of the presentation on their company. I hate that. Right. Say no one cares who you are until the very end if you've convinced them that you can solve their problem.
That's it.
Until then, start off with them. It's all about them. And if you do that, you're going to be more successful.
Isn't that
Definitely.
interesting? Oh, and I see that in presentations, and I also see that in proposals, in the executive summary. Most of the executive summary is all about the company who's putting the executive summary in, not about the customer that they're actually trying to sell into.
Exactly.
And you
Right.
wonder why the customer's going,
Right. You wonder why they're looking at their phones or looking out the window or whatever, and you've lost them. You've lost them before you've even gotten a chance to get to the real reason you're there.
absolutely, absolutely. So we've got drive, asking insightful questions, making it more about the customer. Any other key, I guess, highlights in around high performing teams?
Well, one thing that I always look for is the ability to think on their feet
Yeah,
and to be nimble. So
yeah.
one thing that I recommend for my clients is what I refer to as the hot seat interview.
Ah,
And here's the way that works. Let's say I've got someone that's gone through several rounds of interviews and we think we want to hire them.
yeah.
So what we do is we have the interview team. And what this person does is they do a 15-minute presentation on their background and why they're a good fit for the role. And then they do another 15-minute presentation on the company
Hmm.
and the solution just based on the stuff they can find on the internet and online.
Yeah,
And what that'll show me is how good is this person in action, right?
yeah.
Someone doesn't pick up a professional sports asset, a player or whatever, without putting them through their paces, right?
Yeah,
Go out there and run the 40. Let me see if you can catch the ball. Let me see if you can do this, do that. You got to do the same thing with your salespeople.
yeah.
And that is a very, very telling exercise.
Mm.
And I've had many clients who are dubious about that. That'll say, "Boy, I don't know," and then you do it, and they're like, "Oh, I get it now. I get it." Because honestly, the good ones,
Yeah,
they come in and they pull out both six shooters and they empty them and they just blow holes in the whole thing. It's just like, why do they even have to do this, right?
yeah,
It's obvious that you should hire them. And then others that have interviewed brilliantly up to that point, I've seen them just roll over and go into the ditch.
yeah.
And that's the true test, right? Can they take facts, their own facts? They should be able to sell you on themselves, for goodness sake,
Mm.
but they should also be able to construct a basic overview pitch. And unless you just have absolutely dismal materials that are out on the web, right? But that I've been doing that since the middle 2000s, and it is absolutely foolproof.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that because often as sales leaders, we can get a sense of a person through an interview. And particularly when you talk about personality styles, if you and I are the same personality style, we're going to match pretty quickly, right? So which means there'll be a
Mm-hmm.
level of almost unconscious bias that comes in and says, "Oh, I reckon Don's a really good person because we're getting on like a house on fire. He'll be a great acquisition." But to put them in a hot seat and get another group of people to actually start to review them and put them through their paces removes a lot of that bias and gives you a much more balanced view of how does this person potentially going to go in into the heat of battle, if you like.
Oh
And it's a
yeah.
great way of doing
Yeah.
it.
And I can say, I don't want to say never, but I would be willing to wager 9 out of 10 of the people who come through that process, they go on to perform,
Yeah,
right? They end up being good hires.
yeah, yeah. And that's just the responsibility of a good sales leader, making sure that they're,
Mhm.
because when you think about the onboarding costs and then the cost to the business, if they don't work out to be a good performer, you're back to square one, and that's a bucket load of money that you've just sunk into recruitment costs and onboarding and all sorts of stuff. And by the
Right,
way,
right.
you're probably going to have to be the salesperson for a period of time as well as run the sales team. So you
Oh,
might as
you're
well
going to
have
have to
that up
figure out
front.
how to make up that number, right?
That's
Because your
it.
number doesn't go away just
It
because
does
that
not go
person
away.
didn't work out, right? That's
Absolutely.
that's when you're the leader, that's the reality right there. That number stays the same. Figure it
Absolutely.
out.
Yes. So with all that, let's just bring this into a soft landing and think about some of the vital signs that you talk about in your book in
Mm-hmm.
relation to, I mean, pipeline development, pipeline health, but really driving the business. And I'm always about sustainable success, not just
Mm-hmm.
one, because there are so many, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, so many sales teams and so many sales people that have one good year, then they crash and burn the next year, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
how do we as an organization and as a sales leader, how do we create the environment where we've got the opportunity to be sustainably successful over a long period of time? So from your perspective, what are some of the vital signs you talk about in your book that can drive that sustainable growth?
Well, I think the vital signs give you the framework to do
Hmm.
that. And that, the old adage of you can't measure what you don't metric and you can't improve what you don't measure, right?
Yeah.
You've got to do the measurements. You have to have, but to me, it comes down to things outside of the vital signs.
Hmm.
You've got to be an effective leader. And that there's several facets to that, right? One is there's got to be discipline.
Yeah.
So every week, and I mean every single week without fail, you've got to do a one-on-one with that person.
Yeah.
That's what helps sustain things, because even the best reps and the most experienced ones, when you're going through a pipeline review with them and going through a deal review, they'll be like, you know what? I should have called Darren. You're right. Let me write that down. Right.
Yeah.
And if you do that every week, you understand what's going on with that person.
Mm.
Then you've also got to be a motivator,
Mm.
both in motivating them to do better, but also handing out praise,
Yeah.
because that's motivational. I know very few salespeople who don't like to be stroked, right? Very few. But then you've got to couple that with visibility
Yeah.
and put everything out in the open. So that's where the vital signs kind of come into the leadership piece, which is if you're running a CRM, let's say you're running Salesforce, you should have a dashboard for the entire team with your sales vital signs in it. What's new to funnel? What's our funnel level? What's new to pipe? What's pipeline value? How are
Mm.
we doing in performance to quota? Then you've got to have the same for each and every rep.
Yeah.
And then every week, you've got to rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. And then the very successful leaders, it ends up with accountability.
Yeah.
Right? I'm doing everything I can to help you. We're doing everything we can to motivate and support you. We've got the discipline where we talk every single week, but at the end of the day, I need you to hit your number.
Mm.
And sometimes it's difficult for some sales leaders to put people on a plan.
Mm.
And sometimes you have to,
Yeah.
because we're in a performance business,
Yeah.
like it or not. And if you're a leader and you don't want the reputation that you can't lead a team that doesn't perform, that's the ticket back to being a rep, right?
That's it.
You want to have the reputation that you know how to make teams perform. And sometimes that means making hard decisions.
Mm.
And I think that part of the accountability can be difficult, because accountability isn't beating people over the head, right? Why didn't you close that this month? You said you were, no, that's not it, right? Accountability is, are you doing all the right things with your vital signs to move this in the right direction? And if you're not performing, then you've got to understand
Mm,
that you could be put on a plan.
mm.
And those plans should be constructive, right? They should be very well thought out. They should be actionable. They shouldn't be punitive. I
Yeah.
mean, all the punitive plan's going to do is chase them out the door.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Absolutely.
and that's a fine line to walk when you're the leader, a very fine line, because the other person, despite what you say, hey, look, I want you to achieve this plan.
Yeah.
They're sitting on the other side going, right? You wouldn't have put me on this plan if you weren't going to fire me, type of thing, right? So it can be tough, and that's a tough thing for a leader to understand.
But I think it's also a core responsibility of a leader because if you're going to be driving a high performing team, you need to first of all identify what those vital signs are that we can continue to measure, as you talk about. Because if you
Mm-hmm.
can't manage it, but in the vital signs at the team level, but then the vital signs at the individual rep level, if you're doing that on a regular basis, you're driving accountability. You can figure out where are the trends. Do we have enough opportunities coming into the funnel? What's happening with our discovery calls? What's happening with our conversion calls? Are we doing demos too early in the presentation process, right? That's not then converting.
Right.
So you've got all this information you can use. And I think the point you make around putting people on a plan, I think a lot of people look at that as if it's a negative thing, it's a punitive thing to say, well, if you're on a plan, it means we're going to get rid of you. No, no, we're a high performing team. We believe in you. We want to get you back on track. We need to understand what are the metrics that perhaps are not up to the level that if we focus on them, then you'll get back into the level that we need you to be. But also you'll start to drive more engagement as well because we're here to help you, right? Because you want to be,
Right.
we believe in you, right? So I think the conversation that a leader has then in terms of the weekly one-on-ones and the discipline to keep doing that. And I think from my own point of view, I've had a number of conversations with leaders, with salespeople over the years that I've said directly, hey, my intention is not to get rid of you. My intention is to get back on track.
Right.
But we need to work together in order to do that because we ultimately have to hit this number, right?
Right. Right.
So
And
let's work
in my
together.
opinion, the most important words in a plan, it should start with, because we value you as an employee.
Yes.
That those should be the first words in your plan.
Yeah.
Because we value you as an employee, we're coming to you with this performance improvement plan
Yeah.
because we want you to come up to an acceptable level of performance.
Mm.
And another easy part of accountability, frankly, you got to put it in their compensation plan. There's got to be a line in there that says, if you perform at less than 80% of quota or whatever you want that acceptable level to be, you
Yeah.
may be placed on a performance improvement plan,
Yeah.
right?
So it's
So that
up
it's not
front.
something like, well, where did this come from, right?
Yeah.
That expectation is there from the moment they get that compensation plan.
Yeah. And I think that's just good business. It's just common sense. And I
Mm-hmm.
think most sales people would recognize that and they would know whether they're not up to scratch or not.
Right, right, right,
But if it comes back to us in the first place, onboarding correctly, hiring in the right way, we should, and I say should, inverted commas, should minimize the performance improvement plan requirement moving forward. But there might be always exceptions to that, but you want to set yourself up for success in the first place. So hiring the right type of people for the right roles in the first place is probably the key, but then making sure that when they're in, you as the sales leader make sure what those vital signs are for your business because there might be different businesses that might highlight some different vital signs, but whatever they
sure.
happen to be, make sure you're really consistent with that and disciplined in terms of how you measure them and how you drive them.
Right. And you got to understand your ratios, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, we're probably only going to win 30% of our deals.
Yeah.
So if I want $1 million to come out of that pipeline, I better have $3 million in pipeline value.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And if I want to grow, then I better have stuff coming in at the top in new to funnel
Mm.
in order to push that higher and
Yeah.
increase that value.
Yeah.
Right. The whole, I talk to my clients a lot about pipeline pressure. What
Yeah.
are we doing to create pipeline pressure? And all of that starts at the top.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And there's lots of ways to do that. You can do outbound campaigns, you can do marketing campaigns to get the marketing
Mhm.
qualified leads in. Um, because
But you
without
got to have
buzz,
marketing. You can't do it just by cold calling, right? And I see that mistake pretty commonly,
okay.
right? Well, he's got a territory, he's got a list of customers. Go after. No, it doesn't work that way, right? Someone's got to be having a conversation with the market on a
Yeah.
daily basis.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, you're going to suffer for it.
Awesome, awesome. So, Don, as we bring this into a close, what's some lasting advice that you would give? And I'd like to ask you a question also before we finish, which I'll hold off for a second. But advice you'd be giving to either a young leader or a young person coming into sales today, with all of the experience. What's a couple of things that if they dialed in on to start with, they would give themselves a really good opportunity of really building some momentum in sales.
Sure. Well, for a new salesperson, it would go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is you've got to develop a good questioning routine,
Yeah,
and you've got to ask good, insightful follow-ups. Just don't stop when they say, "Well, you know what? What do your inventory levels typically run at?" And then they tell you, "Well, why do you think that is?"
mm,
Are you running into issues when they're below? What happens then? You've got to be just really, really inquisitive. One,
yeah,
two, you've got to have alligator skin because you're going to live in a world of no. And I think that's difficult for people. I
yeah,
really, really do. And the best and the brightest that I've coached or worked side by side with, they they definitely have alligator skin.
yeah,
It's just everything just rolls off their back. They don't care. You can reject them all day long. They don't care.
yeah, yeah,
They're just driving forward. And the third bit is, again, don't confuse your compelling reason to sell with the prospect's compelling reason to buy. You
yeah,
got to address their needs, right?
yeah. Love
And
it.
if we ratchet that up one more level, to the entrepreneur, sales is probably one of the most important investments that you make.
Mm,
And the quality of your salespeople, there's Harvard Business Review studies out there that basically say, all things being equal, the quality of your salesperson is going to win deals more often than not.
yeah,
So it's not a commodity. And
no,
I'll see that. Sales talent is not a commodity. And that's why the good get paid well.
love it. Love it. Good way to finish. My last question is just one that I wanted to throw in is, as you see, this is the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast. Don, what is your definition of exceptional?
An exceptional leader is someone that has a team that is loyal to them because of the way they have treated them, and that they defend them like they're
Yeah,
their children, and that they do everything they can to remove barriers. I think one of the biggest things a sales leader can do is focus on removing the barriers that get in the way, especially their top performers.
mm,
It should be your job to say, well, wait, if that's in the way, let me solve that problem for you.
yeah,
If you do that, they'll feel. I don't want to say. I mean, beholding is a strong word, right? But they'll feel some amount of regard towards you that raises you up.
mm,
I always used to have the goal when I was working full time of telling people, you know what, when you leave, I want you to tell me I was one of the best managers you've ever had. And
love
I think that's very doable. I think
it. Yeah,
you got to be human with them. You got to be honest with them, and you've got to treat them like, hey, we're all on the same team here,
yeah,
folks. I'm
definitely.
no different than you.
Yeah,
And if you do that, you'll have folks that. I mean, I've got lasting relationships with people that used to work for me.
mm,
20, 25 years later.
yeah, brilliant. And it's a good mark of the impression you've created, and I guess the leadership shadow and the legacy you've created as well,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome, mate. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Thank you. It's now getting darker and darker.
Yeah, I know. I'm still trying to figure out the lighting in my office. I think I've got to put like something over my window to do this properly
No,
because
it's all
it's
good.
gone.
It's all good.
I feel like I'm in an old Queen video.
Sensational. So, Don, for people who wanted to connect with you and learn more about what you do, as well as getting a copy of the book, where's the best place for them to go?
Deliveringvalue.com.
Yep.
There's also a link to the book there. You can also go straight to Amazon if you'd like. Of course, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Yep.
You can find me on Substack.
On what?
Substack.
Substack.
Yes, Substack.
Okay.
It's a place, check it out, substack.com. It's a place where you can post newsletters. I post a weekly article there and then I voice it over.
Okay.
It's just a great place to just kind of stay out there. It's kind of an interesting community, if you ask me.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll check it out. Awesome.
Yeah, check it out.
Brilliant, mate. Thank you so much. Been a great conversation, and yeah, thanks for being a guest on the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure for certain.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. Enjoy.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast. I trust the information in this episode has been helpful in your journey towards becoming exceptional. And remember, please take the time to rate the show, subscribe to the show so other people can find it. But also, if I can help you, jump on my calendar, go to leadwithdarren.com and let's have a conversation about how I can help you along your journey to being exceptional.